Evander adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke, $3,000 Italian silk suit, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire future was about to be violently destroyed in less than 5 minutes. He stood in the gleaming, imported marble lobby of Viridian Zenith, absolutely positive he was about to be crowned their new executive vice president. But when a frail, elderly janitor accidentally bumped a soapy mop handle against Evander's pristine leather briefcase, leaving a single, microscopic drop of water on the leather, Evander didn't just get annoyed. He exploded. He viciously humiliated the trembling old man, screaming that his suit cost more than the janitor's entire pathetic life savings. Then, to make sure the worthless loser knew his place, Evander intentionally kicked the heavy mop bucket across the spotless lobby, sending dirty water everywhere, before proudly strutting into his final interview. Moments later, Evander sat at the massive mahogany conference table, eagerly waiting for the elusive billionaire CEO to walk through the doors and hand him the world. But when the heavy brass handles finally turned, the arrogant executive's smug smile completely vanished, and his blood ran ice cold. Because the man walking into the boardroom to decide his ultimate fate wasn't wearing a designer suit, he was holding a mop. Welcome back to Moments and Meanings. Before we witness the catastrophic downfall of today's villain, take a quick moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below, do you believe that a person's true character is revealed by how they treat those who can do absolutely nothing for them? In a world obsessed with status, wealth, and climbing the corporate ladder, it is terrifyingly easy for people to look down on those they deem beneath them. Today, we are diving into a deeply satisfying, high-stakes story about an arrogant executive who thought his designer clothes and ruthless attitude made him untouchable. But the devastating lesson he learns about respect, power, and the ultimate disguise will completely change how you view every single person you interact with. Let's begin. Evander Sterling did not just walk into rooms, he conquered them. At 34 years old, he was a ruthless, cold-blooded corporate shark who had built his entire career on a foundation of absolute intimidation and zero empathy. For Evander, the world was rigidly divided into two categories: the predators and the prey. As he stepped through the towering floor-to-ceiling glass doors of Viridian Zenith's global headquarters, he fully intended to prove he was the apex predator. Viridian Zenith wasn't just a Fortune 500 company, it was an empire. Securing the position of executive vice president meant a 7-figure salary, private jets, and a level of power Evander had craved since childhood. He had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously preparing for this final interview, ruthlessly sabotaging 2 of his rival candidates just to ensure he was the last man standing. He paused in the center of the sprawling, blindingly bright lobby, adjusting the lapels of his custom-tailored, midnight blue Italian silk suit. The fabric alone cost more than $3,000, a physical manifestation of his superiority. He glanced at the platinum watch gripping his wrist, calculating his next move. The rumors about Viridian Zenith's elusive billionaire founder Silas Vance were legendary. Silas was known to be highly eccentric, heavily guarded, and absolutely merciless in his hiring practices. Evander smirked, running a hand over his perfectly slicked hair. Merciless, he thought. Exactly my kind of boss. But as Evander confidently strode toward the platinum elevator banks, his sharp eyes caught a glimpse of something entirely out of place in the ultra-luxurious environment, a sight that made his upper lip curl in profound, toxic disgust. And little did Evander know, the next 30 seconds were about to trigger a chain reaction that would permanently destroy his entire life's work. An elderly man in a faded, slightly oversized gray jumpsuit was slowly making his way across the imported Italian marble floor. His shoulders were heavily stooped, his silver hair was thinning, and his calloused, wrinkled hands were tightly gripping the wooden handle of a heavy industrial mop. He was methodically pushing a yellow bucket of soapy water, his eyes glued respectfully to the floor as he hummed a quiet, off-key tune. To Evander, the old man wasn't a human being. He was a stain. A pathetic, worthless eyesore ruining the pristine aesthetic of the billionaire empire Evander was about to inherit. Evander intentionally widened his stance as he walked, refusing to yield a single inch of space. In his arrogant mind, the weak were supposed to move out of the way for the strong. He gripped his expensive, imported leather briefcase tightly, keeping his eyes locked straight ahead, completely expecting the old janitor to scurry out of his path like a frightened rat. But the old man, deeply focused on scrubbing a stubborn scuff mark near the elevator doors, didn't look up in time. The collision was practically microscopic, but the consequences were absolutely catastrophic. As the old man pulled the mop back, the wooden handle gently bumped against the side of Evander's passing briefcase. A single, solitary drop of soapy water flew from the bristles and landed directly onto the pristine, hand-stitched leather. The lobby instantly fell completely, terrifyingly silent. Evander froze in his tracks. He slowly lowered his eyes, staring at the tiny, harmless bead of water resting on his expensive bag. For 3 agonizing seconds, he didn't breathe. His jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ground together. The absolute audacity of this pathetic, minimum-wage peasant daring to touch his property sent a wave of blinding, unfiltered rage surging through his veins. "Oh, my deepest apologies, sir," the elderly man gasped, his voice raspy and frail. He immediately dropped his gaze to the floor in a posture of complete submission. Quickly pulling a clean rag from his pocket. "I didn't see you there. Please let me wipe that off for you. I am so sorry." The old man reached out with a trembling hand, merely trying to right his wrong. But Evander violently swatted the old man's hand away as if he were batting away a diseased insect. "Don't you dare touch me with your filthy hands," Evander roared, his voice echoing fiercely off the marble walls, causing several nearby receptionists to jump in sheer terror. The old man physically flinched, shrinking back against his mop bucket, his eyes wide with genuine shock. "Sir, I meant no disrespect. It was a complete accident." "An accident?" Evander sneered, stepping aggressively into the old man's personal space. Using his towering height to cast a dark, intimidating shadow over the frail janitor. "You're not just clumsy, you old fool. You're entirely incompetent. Do you have any idea what this suit is worth? Do you know how much this briefcase costs? It costs more than your entire life's savings. It costs more than the pathetic, run-down shack you probably live in." The old janitor didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. He simply bowed his head lower, absorbing the vicious, venomous abuse with a quiet, sorrowful dignity. "You are right, sir. It is a beautiful suit. I will be more careful." But Evander wasn't satisfied with an apology. His toxic ego demanded utter, absolute destruction. He needed to make sure this loser understood the massive, uncrossable chasm between their social classes. He needed to assert his dominance before walking into the boardroom, entirely convinced that ruthlessness was the exact trait the CEO was looking for. Evander looked down at the yellow mop bucket filled with dirty, soapy water. A cruel, sinister smile slowly twisted his perfectly groomed features. Evander didn't know it yet, but the moment he raised his expensive leather shoe, he wasn't just kicking a bucket. He was officially signing his own professional death warrant. With a violent, aggressive swing of his leg, Evander kicked the heavy bucket directly into the old man's shins. The plastic cracked, and gallons of filthy gray water violently exploded across the pristine marble floor, soaking the bottom of the old man's faded jumpsuit and completely ruining the area he had just spent an hour cleaning. The janitor gasped, nearly losing his balance as the freezing water soaked through his work boots. "Clean it up, you worthless old loser," Evander spat, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. "That's all you're good for anyway. Wiping the dirt off the shoes of men like me." Without a single shred of remorse, Evander adjusted his silk tie, turned his back on the humiliated old man, and proudly strutted through the heavy oak doors leading toward the executive boardroom. He felt a massive surge of adrenaline, entirely convinced he had just proven his superior alpha status. He sat down at the grand 80-foot mahogany conference table, confidently steepling his fingers, completely ready to charm the elusive billionaire CEO. Evander thought he had already won the ultimate prize. He had absolutely no idea that the trap he had just so arrogantly danced into was about to snap violently shut on his neck. The executive boardroom of Viridian Zenith was not merely a room, it was an absolute fortress of unimaginable power. Evander Sterling sat at the head of the colossal, 80-foot polished mahogany table, completely surrounded by towering, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panoramic view of the sprawling metropolis below. Up here, on the 80th floor, the world looked exactly as Evander believed it should. small, silent, and entirely beneath him. He casually leaned back in the plush black leather chair, crossing his legs and resting his pristine hands on his expensive leather briefcase. The adrenaline from his cruel encounter in the lobby was still surging fiercely through his veins. He felt completely invincible. In his toxic, twisted worldview, kicking that mop bucket wasn't a moment of shameful cruelty, it was a necessary demonstration of dominance. He was a shark, and he had simply reminded a bottom feeder of its proper place in the food chain. For nearly 20 agonizing minutes, the massive boardroom remained perfectly, suffocatingly silent. The intense isolation was a well-known psychological tactic employed by billionaire CEOs to rattle nervous candidates. But Evander wasn't nervous. He was practically vibrating with eager anticipation. He repeatedly checked his platinum watch, silently rehearsing the aggressive, cutthroat pitch he had prepared to win over Silas Vance. He was going to walk into this company and tear it apart, maximizing profits by eliminating the weak. Suddenly, the heavy silence of the room was shattered by the sharp, metallic click of the brass door handle. Evander instantly snapped to attention. He aggressively buttoned the center button of his $3,000 custom silk suit, plastered on his most charming billion-dollar smile, and stood up to greet the titan of industry. But as the heavy oak doors slowly swung open, the person stepping into the room wasn't the billionaire CEO, and the terrifying, icy expression on the newcomer's face made Evander's confident smile falter for a fraction of a second. It was a woman in her late 40s, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying efficiency. She wore a razor-sharp crimson pantsuit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, flawless bun. She held a sleek silver tablet in her hands, and her piercing, predatory eyes locked directly onto Evander with a look that could only be described as clinical disgust. "Evander Sterling," she said, her voice perfectly smooth but entirely devoid of warmth. "I am Lysandra Vane, Chief of Staff to Mr. Silas Vance. Please, remain standing." Evander frowned slightly, his toxic ego immediately bristling at her commanding tone, but he forced his fake, charismatic smile back into place. "A pleasure to meet you, Lysandra. I was expecting Mr. Vance. Is he running behind schedule?" Lysandra slowly walked into the boardroom, the sharp clicking of her stilettos echoing aggressively against the marble floor. She didn't offer to shake his hand. Instead, she stopped at the opposite end of the massive mahogany table, staring at him with an unnerving intensity. "Miss Vance is never behind schedule, Miss Sterling," Lysandra replied coldly, tapping a button on her silver tablet. "He is currently in his private observation suite. He has spent the last 30 minutes meticulously reviewing the live security footage from our ground floor lobby." Evander's heart gave a sudden, powerful thump, but a massive wave of arrogant relief quickly washed over him. The cameras. Of course, a ruthless billionaire like Silas Vance would have the entire building under strict surveillance. Silas had undoubtedly watched Evander ruthlessly put that pathetic, clumsy old janitor in his place. Evander's chest puffed out with undeniable pride. He was entirely convinced that Silas was analyzing his alpha male dominance, admiring his refusal to tolerate incompetence. "I see," Evander said smoothly, puffing his chest out. "Well, as Mr. Vance likely witnessed, I don't tolerate mistakes or clumsiness. I demand perfection in my environment. I assume that is exactly the kind of ruthless leadership Viridian Zenith requires for this vice president position." Lysandra stopped tapping on her tablet. She slowly looked up, tilting her head slightly. A chilling, profoundly pitying smirk crept across her face. "Mr. Vance does indeed have a very unique, unshakable philosophy regarding leadership, Mr. Sterling," Lysandra whispered, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "He believes that the true measure of a man's power is never how he treats his equals, but how he treats those who can do absolutely nothing for him." Before Evander could even begin to process the ominous warning hidden in her words, the heavy oak doors behind Lysandra violently swung completely open. The sheer force of the entrance sent a sudden, icy gust of wind sweeping through the boardroom, causing the heavy window blinds to rattle. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed ominously in the corridor, vibrating through the floorboards with the terrifying weight of an apex predator finally stepping into the light. Evander immediately completely forgot about Lysandra. He eagerly stepped forward, extending his hand, fully prepared to look the legendary billionaire directly in the eyes and demand the job. But as the towering figure stepped over the threshold and out of the dim shadows of the hallway, the bright, blinding sunlight of the boardroom illuminated his features. Evander's extended hand froze completely solid in mid-air. The air violently vanished from his lungs. The extravagant $3,000 suit suddenly felt like a suffocating straitjacket. His vision blurred, and the absolute paralyzing force of sheer terror violently slammed into his chest like a runaway freight train. The man walking into the room was not wearing a designer suit. He was wearing a faded, slightly oversized gray industrial jumpsuit, the bottom of the pant legs still heavily soaked with dirty, soapy water. But draped flawlessly over the cheap, wet jumpsuit was a masterfully tailored, razor-sharp charcoal blazer that screamed of unimaginable, billionaire wealth. The stooped, fragile posture from the lobby was entirely gone. The man stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders incredibly broad, radiating a suffocating, terrifying aura of absolute authority. The silver hair that had been messy and thinning was now slicked back with perfect precision. It was the janitor. The exact same worthless old loser Evander had just viciously humiliated, screamed at, and intentionally kicked dirty water on merely 20 minutes ago. The old man's calloused, wrinkled hands were no longer gripping a wooden mop handle. Instead, he was holding Evander's pristine, meticulously crafted resume. Silas Vance, the billionaire founder and CEO of Viridian Zenith, slowly walked to the head of the table. His piercing, icy blue eyes locked onto Evander's pale, terrified face, completely devoid of the gentle, submissive sorrow he had displayed in the lobby. Silas didn't blink. He didn't smile. He simply stared at the arrogant executive, watching the absolute destruction of Evander's entire reality unfold in real time. "You," Evander choked out, his vocal cords completely paralyzing as his knees violently knocked together. You're, I am the man whose life savings you claimed couldn't afford your beautiful briefcase." Silas Vance rumbled, his voice no longer frail and raspy, but booming with the terrifying, undeniable power of a billionaire king. Evander felt the room aggressively spinning out of control, utterly unaware that the absolute worst moment of his entire miserable life hadn't even begun yet. Evander Sterling physically stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking loudly against the polished marble floor. His entire world was aggressively collapsing inward, the walls of the sprawling boardroom suddenly feeling like a suffocating, inescapable prison. The man standing before him, the man whose pants were still dripping with the filthy gray water Evander had intentionally kicked onto him, was Silas Vance, the legendary founder of Viridian Zenith, the billionaire titan who held the absolute power to make or break Evander's entire career with a single snap of his fingers. A cold, terrifying sweat violently broke out across Evander's forehead. His incredibly sharp, usually silver-tongued corporate brain desperately scrambled to find a way out of this catastrophic nightmare. He needed to spin this. He needed to apologize, to grovel, to somehow convince this billionaire that the horrific display in the lobby was just a massive misunderstanding. "Mr. Vance," Evander stammered, his voice trembling so violently he sounded like a frightened child. He desperately held up his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Sir, I had absolutely no idea it was you down there. If you had known I was the CEO, you would have treated me with the utmost respect." Silas interrupted, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate the very glass of the windows. "You would have smiled. You would have politely accepted my apology. You might have even offered to help me wipe the water off your precious bag." Silas slowly walked forward, his piercing blue eyes never once breaking contact with Evander's terrified gaze. "But that is exactly the point, Miss Sterling," Silas continued, stopping just inches from the trembling executive. "You didn't know I was the boss. You saw a man in a faded jumpsuit pushing a mop. You saw someone you perceived to be helpless. Someone who possessed absolutely no power to retaliate against you. And in that moment of unchecked power, you didn't just show me your temper. You showed me your absolute, unfiltered character." Evander swallowed hard, a massive, suffocating lump forming in his throat. But before he could open his mouth to spew another desperate, pathetic excuse, Silas Vance raised his hand, signaling Lysandra at the back of the room, and the true psychological torture officially began. Lysandra tapped a single button on her silver tablet. Instantly, the massive, 80-inch digital screen mounted on the far wall of the boardroom flared to life. Evander whipped his head around, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as high definition. Crystal-clear security footage from the lobby began to play. There he was, in all his arrogant, $3,000 glory. The footage had perfectly captured every single agonizing second of the interaction. The room was deathly quiet as the audio kicked in, amplifying Evander's own venomous, toxic voice echoing through the boardroom speakers. "Don't you dare touch me with your filthy hands." The digital Evander roared on the screen. The real Evander physically winced, his face flushing violently red with profound, inescapable shame. It was one thing to act like a monster in the heat of the moment. It was an entirely different soul-crushing experience to be forced to watch yourself be a monster while the billionaire you were trying to impress stood right beside you. "Clean it up, you worthless old loser," the screen blasted, followed by the sickening, undeniable visual of Evander violently kicking the heavy mop bucket directly into Silas Vance's shins. Lysandra paused the video right on the frame of the soapy water exploding over the billionaire's legs. "Sir, please," Evander begged, tears of absolute panic welling up in his eyes as he desperately turned back to the CEO. "I was incredibly stressed. The pressure of this interview, I haven't been sleeping. I just snapped. It isn't who I really am." Silas looked down at the soaked, ruined bottom of his gray jumpsuit, then slowly shifted his icy gaze back to the weeping executive. "Stress does not create character, Evander," Silas said quietly, the absolute silence of the room making his words cut like a razor blade. "Stress merely reveals it. When you squeeze an orange, you don't get apple juice. You get what is already inside. And when the pressure of this interview squeezed you today, what poured out was toxic, vicious cruelty." Evander felt his knees physically buckle, forcing him to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to stay standing. He was entirely trapped, backed into a corner with absolutely no escape route. "I have worn this exact disguise for every single final round interview over the last 10 years, Silas revealed, the shocking truth echoing through the massive room. "I have bumped my mop into hundreds of candidates. Some were mildly annoyed. Some ignored me. Some actually stopped to help me clean up." Silas took a slow, deliberate step forward, aggressively invading Evander's personal space. But out of hundreds of executives, Silas whispered, his voice dripping with pure, undeniable disgust. "You are the only one who has ever intentionally kicked the bucket over." Evander's breath hitched in his throat. He was officially drowning in his own catastrophic arrogance. But as Silas slowly raised Evander's meticulously crafted, Ivy League resume into the air between them, the arrogant executive was completely unaware that Silas was about to drop a final, devastating bombshell about the water in that bucket, a twist that would shatter Evander completely. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, pressing against Evander's eardrums with the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. Silas Vance, the billionaire titan of Viridian Zenith, stood like a towering monolith of judgment. He held Evander's flawless, heavily embossed resume between his long, calloused fingers. Harvard Business School. Summa cum laude, Silas read aloud, his voice dripping with a terrifying icy calm that sent violent shivers down Evander's spine. "Record, breaking profit margins at your last 3 firms. A masterclass in corporate efficiency." Evander forced a desperate, pathetic nod, a sickeningly hopeful smile twitching on his pale lips. "Yes, sir. I yield results. I can bring that exact same aggressive growth to Viridian Zenith. Just give me a chance to prove my worth." Silas didn't smile. He slowly flipped the heavy cardstock over, staring at the back of the blank page as if searching for a hidden truth. "Society tells us that a piece of paper defines a man's value," Silas murmured, the quiet intensity of his voice demanding absolute attention from everyone in the room. "We are taught to worship pedigrees, to bow down to prestigious universities, and to measure human worth in profit margins. But a piece of paper cannot tell me if a man has a soul." Evander's breath hitched. He felt his pulse hammering violently against his throat. "This resume tells me you are a genius with numbers, Evander," Silas continued, his piercing blue eyes suddenly snapping up to lock onto the trembling executive. "But my lobby footage tells me you are a catastrophic failure as a human being." With a sudden, sickening tear, Silas violently ripped the pristine resume straight down the middle. Evander gasped, his hands instinctively reaching out as if to catch his entire life's work before it fell, but he was entirely paralyzed by fear. Your degrees are utterly worthless here, Silas spat, letting the two halves of the paper flutter to the marble floor like dead leaves. But your arrogance is not just a liability. It is a poison. And to understand exactly how toxic you truly are, we need to talk about that bucket you so proudly kicked over. Evander's eyes darted frantically toward the soaked gray pant legs of Silas's jumpsuit. The filthy water had left a dark, heavy stain around the billionaire's heavy work boots, a physical reminder of Evander's vicious cruelty. I will pay for the dry cleaning, sir. Evander choked out, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. I'll buy you 1,000 new suits. Whatever you want. I just lost my temper over the leather. You lost your temper because you believed your $3,000 briefcase was somehow more valuable than the dignity of a working-class man. Silas rumbled, taking another slow, intimidating step forward. You called the water in that bucket filthy. You called me a worthless old loser who couldn't afford your lifestyle. Silas reached into the pocket of his sharp charcoal blazer, retrieving a small, faded black and white photograph. He tossed it onto the grand mahogany table. Evander's trembling eyes dropped to the photo. It showed a younger Silas, perhaps 10 years old, standing next to an exhausted, smiling man wearing the exact same oversized gray jumpsuit and holding the exact same yellow mop bucket. That man was my father, Silas said, his voice suddenly thick with a profound, unshakable emotion that made the air in the room feel suffocatingly heavy. He worked 70 hours a week scrubbing floors, cleaning toilets, and wiping up the messes of arrogant, entitled men exactly like you, just so he could afford to put food on my plate. Evander physically stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him as pale as a ghost. That bucket you kicked? Silas whispered, leaning over the table, casting a dark, terrifying shadow over Evander's trembling form. That was his actual bucket. I kept it as a reminder of where I came from. And that filthy water? It was completely sterile. I filled it with distilled water this morning. The only thing dirty in that lobby, Miss Sterling, was your soul. Evander felt a wave of absolute crippling nausea crash into his stomach. He had not just insulted a disguised billionaire. He had violently desecrated the sacred memory of the man who built the foundation of the CEO's entire existence. Miss Vance, I swear on my life I didn't know. Evander pleaded, tears of sheer, unfiltered panic finally spilling over his eyelashes and streaming down his cheeks. If you just let me prove myself, I am the best candidate you have. I beat the others fair and square. You need my skills. From the back of the room, Lysandra let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through Evander's desperate lies like a newly sharpened blade. Fair and square? Lysandra sneered, walking forward and tapping a new command into her silver tablet. Do you truly believe a multi-billion-dollar intelligence network wouldn't do a background check on your ethics? The massive digital screen behind them violently flickered. The lobby footage vanished, instantly replaced by a series of highly classified, heavily encrypted corporate emails. Evander's jaw completely dropped. His entire body began to shake with the violent, uncontrollable tremors of a man watching his executioner sharpen the axe. 3 weeks ago, Silas thundered, his icy blue eyes blazing with absolute, unforgiving fury. You hacked into the firm's private server. You intentionally corrupted the financial projection models of Julian Vance and Sarah Jenkins, the other 2 finalists for this position. You sabotaged their presentations so they would look incompetent, ensuring you were the only viable choice left. Evander stumbled backward, his back slamming hard against the towering glass windows. The sheer, terrifying realization that Viridian Zenith knew every single one of his darkest, most closely guarded secrets violently shattered whatever was left of his massive ego. You are not a genius, Evander, Silas spat, towering over the broken executive like an avenging god. You are a coward. A pathetic, insecure coward who has to break the legs of the people around him just to win a race. Evander desperately opened his mouth to deny the sabotage, to scream that the emails were fake, but absolutely no sound came out. His vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the crushing, undeniable weight of his own toxic corruption. He was trapped, utterly exposed in the blinding light of Silas Vance's righteous judgment. Silas slowly reached down and picked up the two torn halves of Evander's resume from the pristine marble floor. He didn't hand them back. He simply held them in his calloused, working-class hands, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, absolute finality. "You thought you were walking in here to claim a throne," Silas whispered, the terrifying quiet of his voice echoing ominously throughout the massive boardroom. "But all you really did was walk into your own professional execution." Evander clamped his hands over his mouth, entirely unaware that the billionaire's final devastating punishment was going to be infinitely worse than just losing the job. Evander Sterling stood completely paralyzed against the towering glass windows of the 80th floor, his mind violently short-circuiting. The ripped halves of his pristine, meticulously crafted resume were now crumpled at the bottom of a stainless steel trash can. He had lost the executive vice president position. He had lost the seven-figure salary. He had lost the private jets, the unyielding power, and the absolute prestige he had ruthlessly clawed his way toward. But as Evander stared into the icy, unforgiving blue eyes of Silas Vance, his toxic ego desperately tried to mount one final, pathetic defense mechanism. He aggressively straightened his posture, frantically tugging at the lapels of his ruined $3,000 suit, trying to salvage whatever microscopic shred of dignity he had left. "Fine," Evander spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw humiliation and desperate defiance. "Keep your pathetic job. I don't need Viridian Zenith anyway. I am still a senior director at a Cavan Financial. I am still an apex predator in this industry. I will walk out of this building, go back to my corner office and crush your company in the market." Evander aggressively grabbed the handle of his expensive leather briefcase, entirely prepared to turn his back and storm out of the boardroom. But from the back of the room, Lysandra let out a slow, chillingly hollow laugh. "You aren't walking back to a corner office, Miss Sterling," Lysandra stated, her voice dripping with absolute clinical execution. "You don't have an office anymore." Evander froze, his hand tightening around the handle of his briefcase. A fresh wave of terrifying, paralyzing dread violently washed over his chest. What are you talking about?" Lysandra didn't answer with words. She simply tapped the screen of her silver tablet one final time. The massive 80-inch digital screen on the boardroom wall violently flickered again. The heavily encrypted emails detailing Evander's sabotage disappeared, instantly replaced by a live, high-definition video conference call. Evander's heart completely stopped. The air vanished from his lungs. Sitting on the massive screen, looking absolutely furious and deeply disgusted, was Richard Croft, the billionaire CEO of Cavan Financial. Evander's current boss. "Mr. Croft." Evander choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. "I have been on a private, encrypted feed with Silas for the last 40 minutes, Evander," Richard Croft thundered through the boardroom speakers, his voice radiating pure, unadulterated rage. "I watched you viciously assault an elderly janitor. And more importantly, I just watched the definitive proof that you illegally hacked into corporate servers to sabotage your rivals." Evander's legs completely gave out. He stumbled heavily into one of the plush leather chairs, his expensive briefcase slipping from his trembling fingers and crashing loudly onto the polished marble floor. "You didn't just violate Viridian Zenith's ethics. You completely destroyed Cavan's reputation," Richard continued, his eyes glaring at Evander with profound disgust. "Security is currently at your desk. They are packing your personal belongings into a cardboard box. You are officially terminated, effective immediately. And I promise you, Evander, I am sending that sabotage file to the authorities. You will never, ever work in corporate finance again." The video call abruptly snapped black. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and entirely catastrophic. In less than 10 minutes, Evander Sterling had lost absolutely everything. His massive salary, his elite status, his flawless reputation, and his entire future had been violently eradicated. His custom-tailored, $3,000 suit was no longer the armor of an invincible corporate king. It was the pathetic, soaking wet costume of an unemployed, blacklisted fraud. Evander slid off the chair and violently collapsed onto his knees on the marble floor. The arrogant, ruthless predator had been completely broken. He buried his face in his trembling hands, sobbing hysterically as the crushing, inescapable weight of his own toxic actions utterly destroyed his soul. "Please," Evander wailed, the tears completely ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. "Please, Miss Vance. I have a mortgage. I have car payments. You can't just take everything away from me over a bucket of water." Silas Vance slowly walked around the grand mahogany table, looking down at the weeping, broken man with an expression of absolute, unshakable justice. "At this company we don't hire skills, Evander," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of ultimate authority. "We hire character. You are fired before you even started." Silas pointed a calloused finger toward the heavy oak doors. "You are free to leave my building," Silas commanded. "But you will not walk out of here as a king. You will leave the exact same way you treated the helpless." Evander looked up through his tears, completely terrified by the ominous finality in the billionaire's voice. Unaware that the absolute worst humiliation of his life was waiting for him downstairs. 10 minutes later, the elevator doors chimed open on the bustling, blindingly bright ground floor of Viridian Zenith's global headquarters. The lobby was packed with hundreds of elite executives, visiting dignitaries and administrative staff. The heavy, suffocating silence instantly swept across the massive room as Evander Sterling slowly stepped out of the elevator. He didn't have his expensive leather briefcase. He didn't have his arrogant smirk. Under the watchful, unyielding gaze of the building's security team, Evander slowly walked over to the massive puddle of dirty, soapy water he had violently kicked across the marble floor nearly an hour ago. His face was flushed a deep, humiliating crimson. Tears of pure, unfiltered agony streamed down his cheeks. Slowly, agonizingly, the former apex predator sank down onto his hands and knees in front of hundreds of staring witnesses. Because Silas had refused to let him use the mop, Evander pulled out his pristine, hand-stitched white silk pocket square. Trembling violently, Evander placed his hands on the freezing wet marble. He began to wipe up the soapy water, the dirty liquid completely soaking into the knees of his $3,000 Italian suit, permanently ruining the expensive fabric. The executives in the lobby whispered and pointed. Cell phone cameras flashed. Evander's total catastrophic destruction was absolute. He scrubbed the floor, weeping hysterically, finally realizing the horrific, life-altering truth. His designer clothes and massive ego could not protect him from the devastating consequences of a rotten, toxic soul. He had kicked a helpless old man down, entirely convinced he was untouchable. Now, he was the one on his knees in the dirt, completely broken by the very man he thought was beneath him. The lesson from this story in our relentless pursuit of success, wealth, and power: it is terrifyingly easy to measure a person's worth by their job title, their bank account, or the clothes on their back. But true character is never revealed in a boardroom. And it is never proven by how you treat the CEO. True character is exclusively defined by how you treat the people who can do absolutely nothing for you. Position may dictate your role in society, but respect dictates your worth as a human being. Never, ever look down on someone, unless you are reaching your hand out to help them up. Every moment has a meaning, but not every truth is easy to face. If this story brought you a massive sense of justice, hit the like button and subscribe. Comment character over cash below if you believe that a kind heart is infinitely more valuable than an expensive suit. This is Moments and Meanings by Anne, and I'll see you in the next story.